Okay, well, I thought we were going to move on to Abram and Sarai, or Abraham and Sarah, but I got to combing through my different commentaries, and I found some really neat comments from Naomi Rosenblatt and Joshua Horwitz, the lady who's a psychologist, a counselor, and how she brings those perspectives in reading these texts. And then Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Genesis, the Book of Beginnings, Covenant and Conversation. He has some really good thoughts too. So before we go flying by and miss out, I guess we'll be contradicting God's claim to go and spread out all over the world. We're going to stay a while in Babylon at the tower and think about it so we can learn from this story. Anyway, from her psychological perspective, the title of her chapter is The Tower of Babel, The Folly of Spiritual Materialism. And then she quotes Psalm 10:18, "Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before the fall." And she points out how technology has robbed us of leisure time and solitude, where we can get closer to God and open our hearts and minds to God, but we're so busy with the technology, it crowds God out. We have all this data processing and search engines that are more convenient. We don't have to go to the library. We don't have to get in a car and drive and hunt around for a parking place and get out and go in and try to find which part of the library is the materials we want and all of that, or get in a car and drive all over the country and go to the courthouse and look at the public records in order to gather information. We can just go online and it goes all over the world for us. But what she says, even though we have all of that, it does nothing to nourish our souls and to teach us compassion. However, there are a few YouTube clips that might do that. Those little films that catch some real life happenings, but a lot of that's not. But anyway, but then even the technology, speaking of all of that, it hasn't been too long that we've had a few of these horrible stories about teenage suicides because, and particularly girls, have had the cyberbullying. And it just rips their heart out, and they don't feel like anybody loves them or cares for them, and they tell them, well, why don't you go kill yourself? And they do. And it's such a tragedy that that's what technology enables. But anyway, what does all that have to do with the Tower of Babel unless we can envision cell phone towers stuck to the sides of the Tower of Babel? However, Rosenblatt says, along with a few other scholars, that there's a minor point in the story that has such a huge technological advancement for human culture. Anybody remember what it was? Fired bricks. They're stronger. They last longer. And so they were able to build houses 1 or 2 stories, but the big monumental buildings couldn't be built with the sun-dried bricks. And so they were able to develop a much more stable building program, and that then enabled rulers to decide to make a name for themselves and start building these big buildings. And then they talked about bitumen or tar and pitch would be. Now you can do a lot dry stacking. You're not dry stacking your new house, are you? No, you're going to use mortar, using mortar, and the mortar holds them. But dry stacking, you can get them up pretty high, but if someone pushes it from the side, it might give unless you make several layers. But that's kind of what they did in these towers. That reminds me, as I was thinking about that, when I was in college, I was in a fraternity house at the University of Kansas that was housed in the home of John Palmer Usher, who was Secretary of the Interior in Abraham Lincoln's cabinet. His wife was horribly afraid of tornadoes, so they built a house. I measured from the inside wall to the outside wall. It was 24 inches. It had 15-inch thick limestone block on the outside and then all this structure on the inside. But after my junior year, I was a co-rush chairman, and I was supposed to go out and visit folks, but my dad was a general contractor, so I got a job to earn some money during the summer months, and I'd go make calls in the evening, and I worked day as a laborer on a construction site and there in town. But on the second story, it had plaster ceiling, and I don't know what caused it, but a big patch fell down. Well, we didn't have a whole lot of money, so I realize now as an adult with lots of years, I should have called the alumni trustee group and say, this happened, we need it fixed. But I thought, well, it's all old and rotted, and we just tore all the plaster down and all the lath and then put some little things and got some acoustical tile, and I fixed it. But when I was up there on the ladder, and these were 15-foot high ceilings, I could see an interior wall that was, where the ceiling was, and there were 2 courses of brick for the interior wall. And I thought that was really interesting. But anyway, brick creates some strength, and you can not just have one course. Most of the brick we see today is just veneer. It's stuck on the outside. It makes it a little stronger, but it's not carrying the weight of the structural support. It's just making it a little more solid. But anyway, the development of brick was an advance in the technology. Now, what Rosenblatt says, this was the beginning of idolatry, as what became, instead of looking just to God, what man had built became an object of his own creation, and that for his admiration, and then an object of worship rather than as a tool to serve human needs. It's a subtle shift, and we will find throughout the Scripture there's lots of evil and sin and wickedness, but so often the most difficult sins are just a subtle shift, just barely stepping over the line from what was seemed to be good until we stepped over the line and corrupted it. And there will be a lot of these. And this kind of touches on it. But anyway, the story is a reminder that we are truly linked to God by good deeds and righteous behavior and not by brick and mortar. She does say that with architecture and technology, they're not inherently good in themselves or evil in themselves. It's how we use them. And she used the expression, we can build homeless shelters or we can build monuments to our own self-glory. And in that, when I read that, I got to thinking about ORU. ORU. Now, sadly, and this is my opinion, that poor Oral, and by the shame and embarrassment of Richard, that too much of the drive of that family and that institution was to make a name for themselves. His tower, the medical center tower that he wanted to build, make a name for himself. The medical school failed. The law school failed. The medical facility may have succeeded if it had been built in North Tulsa, where medical facilities are desperately needed. Not in South Tulsa with St. Francis and South Crest and St. John Broken Arrow and Hillcrest or South Crest. It's just all kinds of medical facilities out south. But anyway, if a 900-foot Jesus really told him that, I believe that 900-foot Jesus would have said, build it there where it's needed. But if you want to make a name for yourself, build it wherever you want. But anyway, that's, like I said, just my opinion. But the fact that he names his school after himself, if that's not trying to make a name for yourself. And then another thing I thought of as my mind was turning here, you know, the praying hands, that's a model of his hands. If it were I would have gone to Calcutta and found Mother Teresa and asked, could I make a mold of your hands? Just my opinion. Okay. Anyway, I took a course in college in architecture. I'd forgotten about that. Did you know I took a course in architecture? It was at the University of Kansas. Well, no, it was a class. I'm sorry. I took a class. Thank you for correcting me. I took a class in architecture, and it was called, they called it the School of Architecture and Urban Design. And the course I took was a theoretical class to attempt to help the architects to appreciate how design can blend into the environment so that it fits where it is, and both the environment and the building kind of mutually reinforce and complement each other, instead of a building stuck somewhere, maybe a beautiful building someplace, but where it's put, it's like a sore thumb. It just doesn't fit. But anyway, but not only that, but in the aesthetics of it enhancing, but instead of just being beautiful, they talked so much about form following function. You ever hear that? Form following function. There are some buildings that are beautiful works of art, but it's a terrible place to work. It just doesn't work well, or it's terribly uncomfortable, where the beauty was the key point, and they lost sight of the function and lost sight of the human community in the workplace, the surrounding neighborhood, and how things should work together to build community and to help things work well and be successful. Again, back to the ORU Medical Center, that tower, you might know, because you might have talked to, who was the architect on that? You weren't, were you? Okay. Well, as I have driven by on Lewis, and I've looked at it, I don't know if the architect intended, but, you know, it goes up in the tower, but the lower part has this kind of brass-colored angle. And what that does, it creates, all the bottom part of the building has automobiles stuck to it. The reflection of the angle reflects the parking lot and throws the parking lot up on the side of the building. Now, that may have been a part of the design, and that's what they wanted. I think it's a distraction and a takeaway from the beauty of the building, because you want to look at the building, all of a sudden you're seeing the parking lot with a lot of cars instead, because it has that mirror on it. Anyway, I have a note in here. Wally, do you have any reflections from your lifetime career in architecture to deal with these themes that challenge us?
Oh, absolutely.
You want to make a comment? I'll draw on your expertise. Uh-huh. And they did well yesterday. They found their game, yeah. Instructor then? Uh-huh, yeah. Oh, good. Y'all hearing this? It's picking up? Yeah.
We heard a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, and this tower. And it doesn't.
Okay.
Get in there.
Okay. Okay, there's the architect that missed that class. He was...
He thought it,
Mm-hmm.
He was great.
Mm-hmm.
So we were taught to do that for the people.
Right, yeah.
It's
Read that last line.
and the buyer of your service decides.
Yeah. 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 As best as you can, and you know, really you are a consultant and you offer, but if the buyer doesn't buy, you don't have any influence anymore. You're fired. I'm going to go get somebody else who will do what I tell them to do. Well, that whole theme does have some theological implications in that if we are following God's will to be a positive influence in the world, then what we do needs to help that to happen. So this kind of brings us into an issue that this text kind of deals or touches on, and that's a tension within the church with buildings that are beautiful houses of worship, the temples and the cathedrals. Now, ostensibly, we build them to God's glory, and they are to help us worship and connect with God. That's their intent. Or like some of the great cathedrals in Europe, and this Catholic bishop in Germany spending 41 million or something just for his own residence and remodeling stuff. Pope Francis has called him on the carpet for that. But anyway, it can get out of balance. As Wally said, there's a balance when the funds could be used for acts of charity and kindness and community development, or starting goodwill industry, or food banks, or community gardens, or feed and clothe and educate and train the poor and the disadvantaged. We're finding that in a lot of places it is so much more cost-effective to build some apartments for the homeless. As long as they're homeless, they're tying up police, trying to round them up and move them from one place to another. If they find them falling over in the curb, our culture is compassionate enough, we will not let people die in the street. But yet, we call an ambulance, we take them to the emergency room, and anybody been in the emergency room and got your bill? And I see we've got some that are connected to our church because they've got relatives and they end up on our list, that's what's happening. They're in and out of being homeless, they're on the street, they end up being in the hospital. They don't just give them a Band-Aid and send them back on the street. They put them as inpatient for days and weeks at a time. That's tens of thousands of dollars. That's just the medical part. And we've got one that I'm thinking of. He's been in and out so much, I'm sure it's over $100,000 of medical expenses that he hadn't paid a dime because he's homeless. But an apartment doesn't cost that much, and when they have a place to be, they found it's just a fraction of the cost taxpayer-wise, and they do better because they're in a safe, dry place. They're not getting sick or beat up so much, and medical people can check on them, make sure they stay on their medicines, and a lot of times they get to where there's stability there, and then they start wanting more out of their life, and they get sober and get jobs, and they don't need that anymore. But if we say, no, they didn't earn this, we don't want to spend the money there, just forget about that part. If we had the resources to spend the other way, let's direct them a different way. And Tulsa's starting to catch on to that and do that, and we're seeing some successes. But anyway, the question of cathedrals and chapels and beautiful church buildings and using those dollars, we struggle with that in our budget building every year. How much should we go to keeping this building attractive? Wiggle in your chair for our own comfort. The heating and the air conditioning. How much should we do? Now, on the one hand, and this was pretty much has been our philosophy, is that we want to have an attractive place that calls attention to God. And the architecture with the tower and the praying hand symbols tries to do that. And where we hope to be drawing folks into a relationship with God and the family of God, but it's real easy for churches to cross the line. I remember reading an article once about two different churches, and one was in, they're both in downtown areas where the city was changing and it was becoming more crime infested. One church decided to deal with that by building an iron, strong, high fence around the church to keep the bad element out and protect itself. Another church focused its ministry to a soup kitchen, counseling and, a rescue mission. And, which was more Christ-like? That's a struggle big downtown churches have all over the country. How should we respond to God's call and the need? And it's real easy to cross over that line when we've moved into a spiritual pride or a self-serving, our own comfort needs, and get to a, look at me, look at us. We have a beautiful building. How many of you are proud whenever you watch the news and you see Boston Avenue on that background? I mean, that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. But it's only good is if when people see Boston Avenue, they do not have that image like some people still have, and it's a mistaken image. That's just a church full of a lot of rich people who don't care about anybody but themselves. Now, that's not true, but some people have gotten that image somehow. But when people see Boston Avenue Church, we're hoping they will know, that's the church that's really involved in the interfaith dialogues. That's the church that's open to the Martin Luther King celebration every year. That's the church that gives the most to Crop Walk. That's the church that is involved in Downtown for Good. That's the church that cares. Hopefully, folks have that idea. But if it's always a struggle to keep the balance right and proper. The flip side of that is if we spend all our money and give all our money away and we don't have any money left to take care of the building. I've seen churches where the sign hadn't been painted in 20 years and you can hardly read it. And the weeds are growing all over the garden. In fact, the St. Stephen's Church out in Broken Arrow where I used to serve, I drove by it to take Bobby to school at Broken Arrow South, and the front flower bed was all full of weeds. And my next door neighbor goes there, is on the trustees, and I told him, Victor, that flower bed is giving a terrible message to the community. We can't even take care of our flower bed. What's that going to say to a person looking for a church? If they can't take care of their building, to paint the sign, to weed the flower bed, there must be problems there. One, they can't get their act together and get organized to do these things. Why can't they just pull together a work day? If you don't have the money, you can do a work day and everybody come together and let's spruce up the church, make it look nice. Or the other part is, I want to go someplace that's going to lift my spirits, and if I see all this stuff in decay, that's going to drag me down. I want to be lifted up. I don't want to be dragged down. So there's one of our district superintendents once had called it buildings evangelism. And what he's saying is not that we have to build really rich and luxurious facilities, but he's saying your building conveys a message. And be sure that your building conveys the message you want it to convey. But it needs to be form following function from our architecture school. Well, anyway, those are things that we struggle with all the time. And then the question of whose responsibility is it? I'll never forget this one. When I was down at the Ada Church, one of our senior members had come to church and came in, and she was so upset because in coming in at the curb was either a pop can or I think it was a pop can, aluminum can at the curb. She stepped over it and came in and was madder than hops that we didn't police the area well enough before church. And I'm thinking, now whose job is that? At that church, we didn't have the custodial staff that was here. The custodian doesn't come on Sunday morning. It's lay people and others that turn on the lights and get things going. The custodians there just cleaned. Our custodians are wonderful. They do lots of other things for us and are very helpful because we've got so much more going on. But, I'm thinking it's good that she cared about the church and had such high standards for cleanliness, but how many seconds did that take? And there's plenty of trash cans once she gets inside. But there's a healthy pride and an unhealthy pride. The healthy pride is you care about things doing well and being well. And like a church that's all run down, it's kind of like a person who has depression. If you know somebody who is usually, dressed nicely, made up nicely, they look nice, and then you start seeing them not caring about how they look, that's a strong indication this person's depressed. This person's depressed. And then you see a church that way, I think that congregation is depressed. But healthy pride means you want to be your best, you want to look your best, not for self-glory, but just to be your best. Now, many of you know, fortunately, Dr. Biggs in his 32 years of leadership helped us develop a really good, healthy endowment fund that takes care of lots of the major issues to maintain this facility and relieves our annual budget from being bankrupt by huge building needs every year, because there's always something every year. So we are very blessed that way. And we're in our commitment campaign. Those of you who are early service and the last few services have been here. And David, remind us of that and help us think through that. But our focus really is and continues to try to be that the way we connect to God is through our self-giving love and care, generosity, of course, but it's a self-giving aspect and not a self-glorification effort. Well, anyway, Rosenblatt reminds us that in many ancient cultures, they built towers to the heavens, but in our 20th and 21st century, she points out that in our great cities today, there is still the drive to build great towers that symbolize power. The Empire State Building, and I'm pretty sure she lives in Manhattan because her book is published by a publisher on Broadway, 1540 Broadway, just down the street from where I went to seminary. And then anyway, we think about the name, Empire State Building. Empire. That's some power that has conquered and has maintained control over some vast area and great numbers of people. And then state, that's a symbol of governmental power and structure. And anyway, and then we had the World Trade Centers. When she was writing, they hadn't been destroyed yet, but she mentioned those two. World Trade Center, center of the financial workings of the whole world. So why was that a target for terrorism? Obviously, it's a symbol of power and domination. And if you felt put down by power and domination, want to strike back, then you want to bring down the giant. Remember David and Goliath. David was pretty smart. He couldn't whip Goliath in a one-on-one fisticuffs, but he figured out Goliath's weakness, and he was able to bring him down. Well, Rosenblatt, like I said, who lives in New York, I believe, was looking at these headquarters of the financial giants, and she says literally they scrape the skyline. And then no wonder that our greatest hurt to our way of life was not the horror and the tragedy of human loss, or human life that was lost, as great as that was, but the disruption of our economy and our fear, the loss of our confidence in all aspects of our system and our technology to protect us, our technology to be the God who protects us. We lost our sense of that security. And then no wonder George Bush was urging our country to basically fight back by going shopping. Y'all remember that? Go shopping. It seemed ludicrous. But on the other hand, it's the most obvious way of showing that business as usual. You didn't take us down. You didn't have any effect. We're just going to carry on. And it's kind of like if someone's trying to aggravate you, you just encourage the aggravation if you let them get under your skin. I mean, it's like when someone's teasing you. I've told my sons when they went to school, if anybody's teasing you and calling you names, if you get mad, you just give them power. You take their power away if you just ignore it. You didn't get under my skin. I'm not going to reinforce your teasing of me. It's kind of risky because sometimes they may up the ante and they'll start pounding on you instead of just teasing you. But anyway, usually just ignore it and they go away. Well, oh my gosh, we hadn't even got all the way. Rabbi Sachs had some other interesting comments on the tower that I found helpful too. He's saying the ziggurat, the great symbol of Babylon's power, now, he said it was in the cradle of civilization where human beings first began a lot of things. They settled in the Tigris and Euphrates Valley, and it was where the first cities were established. And not only that, but agriculture was established where you grow crops. You're not just hunter-gatherer or herders. And then technology, some other things began there besides the brick. It says the wheel. I believe the wheel was invented in this area. And the arch. The arch. One of our distinctions here at the Boston Avenue Church is the arch. Not the curved arch, but the broken arch. It's everywhere, the broken arch. So if you hadn't ever noticed the symbols of broken arch, broken arch, broken arch. It's everywhere to carry the theme, and the reason for that architecturally is strength. It has strength, but the other part is to tie all the symbolism and the building together with the theme of that it's all connected. It's part of the great plan, the great design. It's not hodgepodge like I talked about the University of Kansas buildings. They're not all the same. They're all different. But a theme like, at the game yesterday with OU, they show pictures of the campus, and it's all the red brick with the limestone capstones and stuff. It has a sense of unifying and holding it all together. But the symbol of the strength that allows things to develop and grow more in the building phase of things. But anyway, let's see, and the calendar. They developed a calendar. Well, Sachs points out the literary techniques are often tied to spiritual and moral messages. And he brings up these word plays and ironies and puns and inversions. And I found this really interesting. The brick, and he has an LVN is the letters in making brick are inverted to NVL, which means confuse, which shows the results of human behavior are often the very opposite of what's intended. They wanted to build with bricks this glory, but instead of doing that, it had the opposite effect of having the confusion come. They wanted to concentrate on themselves, one city, one place, and not be scattered, but the result from the confusion was they got dispersed all over the world. They wanted to make a name for themselves, but their name becomes an eternal symbol of confusion, a symbol of their failure. They become not a name of honor and glory. It becomes Babel, which is babble, just nonsense, just babble, babble, babble. It doesn't make any sense. That's not a sense of glory and wonder to the world. But what they didn't realize, and it's lifted up in the story, or not lifted up, but it's a subtlety in the story that Sachs points out, was that the contrast that their technological advance to build and construct towers and grand buildings was, they thought their pride and glory, and they failed to realize that the greatest creative power is the power of language. And then he goes back to chapter 1 of Genesis, and all of this is pretty much by one redactor, but pulling all these stories together. Chapter 1, where the word spoken, God said, and it was. But more than that, the Word as the power to create, not just God in physical terms, but Sachs says this is what is holy in the Bible. It's not power itself, but it is the use to which the power is employed. And this is linked to language, because language is used to frame our ideas, to frame our ideals, to construct imaginative possibilities, to give hope and to inspire, and to call others to join us in realizing the vision and the possibilities. It takes language to get cooperation. Confusion breaks cooperation. You can't do anything unless you can talk to one another and understand each other and get together and accomplish something. So words inspire and persuade for the cooperative efforts. So the words come first before the work begins. You negotiate the contract. You write it all out so everybody's on the same page and understands. And again, looking at the literary clues to the meaning, Sachs says of the Tower of Babel story, it's looking bad to the creation story in Genesis, back to the creation story. It's a story about heaven and earth. He says all the little words seem to rhyme with heaven throughout that story. And the word is tov, T-O-V, good. It's used 7 times in Genesis 1, creation. And it's not about God's power, but about God's goodness and the goodness of the universe. He says other religions viewed the world as chaotic and violent and dangerous, threatening, and meaningless. It didn't make sense. But the way the Hebrew faith envisioned God bringing order and meaning out of the chaos was not creation ex nihilo, creating out of nothing, but that the chaos was there and God brought order, is the vision of those folks. It was later Greek thinking of the Hellenistic age that started the creatio ex nihilo. But anyway, separation, the water from the dry land, the heaven from the earth, the night from the day. And in that, God was establishing boundaries. Everything in its right place. Well, the separate distinguishes and divides, and the goodness is order, evil is disorder, the act or the person or the entity in the wrong place is disorder. So the word sin, he says, comes from the verb missing the mark, missing the target. Another word for meaning it's not where it belongs, where you want it, at the bullseye, but somewhere off. And another word for sin, avera, means transgression. It means stray across a boundary into forbidden territory. It's a trespass. And it says, Psalm 115, verse 16, the heavens are the heaven of the Lord, but the earth God has given to man. And the bottom line, and so often there's places we'll come to this, God is God, man is man, or humans are humans, and we're not supposed to be the same. The sin in the Tower of Babel, he's saying, is the people wanted to become like gods. They wanted to transgress the boundary. They wanted to build a tower so they could get from earth into heaven or create their own heavenly space. They weren't content with the earth. They wanted to build an abode in the heaven. And the irony is that this greatest ziggurat was only 300 feet high, and even though they tried, they couldn't reach heaven. And so, in one sense, the story's making fun of them. That's why in the ancient Hebrew author uses the expression, God had to come down and see what in the world were they doing. They thought they were building a tower up to heaven to be with God, but they didn't even come close. God had to come all the way down and see what in the world were they doing. And then he saw that, well, basically they're disobeying. I told them to go throughout all the world, spread out, fill the earth, and they're disobeying. No telling how much mischief they're going to get into. Let's confuse their language. And then, like I said last week, that word could have been confused. They're communicating so they can't hear and understand each other. Well, the other irony Sachs points out is that when the human beings try to become more than human, try to be equal to God and divine, when we do that, we actually become less human. In seeking the divine power and status and to be godlike, it corrodes our conscience. And it hardens the heart and confounds our understanding. And one of the things that does is if we want to be godlike, then we have the attitude we're better than the rest of the folks. And then better than, then we have special privileges which can put us above the law because the divine folks make the laws for the underlings. And so this whole corruption of who we are and our sense of who we're accountable to gets all messed up and corrupted. So the world of the good is a world of order with boundaries and limitations. Being human is living within the limitations, living fully within the limitations and the boundaries. There is so much here to enjoy and appreciate and understand. Why do you want to go somewhere else? Stay here, take some time, experience and enjoy the goodness.